Hey, Cass.
Hey Alex, and welcome to this episode of Lockean Diaries. Today we have a very exciting guest, Peter West, who's interested in feminist philosophy.
Peter, if you want to take a moment just to introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, hi guys. Okay, I am interested in feminist philosophy. That is definitely true. But it probably isn't true to say that my expertise is in feminist philosophy. I guess sort of I'm already being a nerdy philosopher and being more specific than you asked. But I guess what I do is the history of philosophy, right? So I guess I would usually describe myself as a historian of philosophy more than a philosopher, which is a good way of not having to have any answers to philosophical questions myself. I can just palm them off on somebody from the past. Um, but yeah, but I guess what I'm interested in doing and what I do in a lot of my research is the history of philosophy through something like a feminist lens. So looking back over, the last 2000 years or so, although I don't cover all of that. That would be too much for one person. But looking back at philosophy's history and trying to shed light on the work of a lot of figures, particularly women who have typically kind of been lost to history. So that's broadly what I do. I do some other things within the history of philosophy too, but that's that's me.
That's great. Yeah. So just to give our audience a little bit more insight into you, we're going to play our favorite game of quickfire philosophy. Is it alright if I start, Cass?
Yeah,
Is
go for
that
it.
um? I'm really sorry for the question I'm about to ask,
I'm
but
scared.
I'll
my
wait until you've asked it before I see whether I accept that apology.
Okay, so my quick fire philosophy question for you to give you your little 60-second overview is about the ship of Theseus. So just give a little outline for our audience who might not have heard of it before. The ship of Theseus is quite a famous thought experiment. It talks about a damaged ship in its simplest terms. Um, and if we took the pieces of this ship and we replaced them one by one until none of the original pieces remained, can we still call it the ship of Theseus, or does it become something entirely new? So there we go, 60 seconds. What's your thoughts?
Okay. This would be a good if I it'd be good if I had a historical figure to mind who had a good answer to this, because I'd be following through with what I said I'd do. But I don't, so I'll have to answer it myself. And that's I've usefully taken up most of the 60 seconds just saying that. I guess, what do I think? So one answer is to say that for something to be the same thing from one time to another is for its parts to be the same. If that's the case, then it's not the same ship once all its parts have been replaced, right? But I guess the thing that generates the puzzle here is that the parts aren't all changed at the same time. They're changed over a period of time. So it seems intuitively like it is the same ship, because there was no point at which like the whole thing was switched over. Um, I think here's an answer. If the thing that you're on board at the end of the journey is playing the same role for you that it was playing at the beginning of the journey, it's the same thing. So I'd hedge my bets and say yes, it is, but maybe not for the usual reason.
Okay. I
Yeah,
think
that's
that
very
might be the
interesting.
shortest round we've ever played. So,
Yeah, I was expecting
should
like a
we?
5 minute ramble.
Yeah, should
Yeah,
we?
but that's
We'll end
good.
the episode here. He's won. Like that's it. We're over.
Yes,
Um,
This is the correct
so
answer,
that's what
guys.
I'm here for, to win.
No, just
No,
to follow up,
exactly.
I think the idea of time that you introduced there was
Mm,
really interesting because there's been further expansions to this model of thinking to do with if we invented time travel and things like this. If
mm,
the body was destroyed and then recreated somewhere new, if people were traveling through space and time, are they still the same person? And it's this
mm.
idea of mind can be introduced there. So I think considering that idea of time is really interesting. I'll
Right.
pass off the.
'Cause you guys are into Locke, right? So the sort of
Mm,
Lockean answer to the question in regard to people, because I guess it's one thing to talk about ships, The
Yeah.
people version of this is this thing that people say a lot, which is every 7 or 8 years, every cell in our body is replaced, right? So
Yeah.
it's a bit like the wooden planks in the ship, every part of our body is replaced. So that might seem to indicate, well, that's kind of weird because it sounds like maybe I'm not the same person. I mean, in a sense, I'm not the same person I was 7 years ago, right? Like, but in another sense, it seems like, well, I definitely am. I am still me. The Lockean way of explaining that is, well, because you have shared memories with that person from 7 years ago, right? So you remember being them. Doesn't really work with ships, though, does it? That's the ships, as far as I know, unless you're a panpsychist, you think that everything is conscious. Ships don't remember things, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a ship, so I can't speak on their behalf, but
Yeah, I wouldn't want to speak for ships either. Yeah, that's not my place to speak for them.
no, shall I, I'll pass, that was a really, great follow-up there, but if I'll pass off to Cass, who's
Yeah, for
got
sure.
another ridiculous question for you.
Yeah, I am very sorry for this, by the way. But I'll probably ask the question first and maybe add some background to it. So my question is, who would win in a physical fight at the University of Cambridge, Wittgenstein or Karl Popper? So the context behind this is that Popper, who is both are analytic philosophers, and Popper, who is a critical rationalist, believe that philosophical problems are real and they could be solved, but Wittgenstein, on the other hand, thought that they could not be solved and language was the barrier to that. And they both had a very explosive relationship. So who would you think would win, Wittgenstein or Karl Popper? At a physical
Right.
fight, by the way.
These are the guys who actually did have a fight, right? Or there's this thing.
Yeah.
It's Popper, right? That one or other of them brandished a red hot poker, supposedly at the other. I don't really have a picture of Popper in my head.
He's quite a
Whereas,
small guy, I think.
okay,
Didn't
well
he have quite a fabulous moustache?
I don't know.
I might,
Okay.
Maybe.
It sounds plausible.
Let's see.
It'd fit the time period.
Yeah, you know what? I reckon Wittgenstein was a pretty. I sort of feel like he's the type of guy who could be played by like a sort of wiry Christian Bale in like a gritty film about the life of Wittgenstein. I get the impression he's probably not like super buff, but he was probably like a wiry little. And he in the war he went and did some kind of manual labor working in hospitals and stuff instead of he seemed like a guy who exercised his body as well as his mind, as far as I know. I know he used to spend time in the mountains and stuff as well. So probably Wittgenstein. I also just think, he's a pretty stubborn guy. He'd probably fight to the death.
Yeah, I get that impression.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I get that impression too. Especially if they're explosive.
Do we know who brandished who with the weapon? Because I get the feeling from Wittgenstein that he's quite the gentle giant type. He's sort of, he's not one to instigate such a fight.
I think there are
he
stories
instigated
about
the
him
fight.
having a bit of a temper, though.
Yeah.
Wittgenstein.
Yeah.
He didn't like the fact that whoever had like a different opinion to him, like if someone had a different opinion to him, he would just storm out the room. So
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
we're lucky enough that that's never happened to us before.
Yeah.
Can you imagine? Just ask such an awful question that they just give up straight away.
Oh, that is true. That would be the shortest one then.
I do like that we always play this game and start with an apology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
But you're speaking to philosophers, though. Maybe the apology is unnecessary because they love to talk. I should say.
They do love to talk, and I think that's what's so. Yeah, I think that's what's so funny about this game is nobody can ever keep it short. But you did a great job there. I'd say that was
impressive.
We're gonna call you our reigning champion so far.
Yes.
And whoever comes next is gonna have to top that.
Well, the Olympics are on at the moment, right? So
yeah.
I'm going to I'm going to pretend you've given me a gold medal in keeping my answers short.
We're gonna give you the gold medal here.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll have to play the footage back and we'll do a ranking between all of our guests and see.
Yes,
see
we should. We'll have like a separate video on like tier list. Yeah.
Yeah, and normally we make them waffle more because we ask good follow-up questions. But that was a great intro. But now moving on. So we've got 3 feminist philosophers that appear throughout history here that we're going to sort of focus our time on.
Oh
We're
yeah.
gonna keep it. You wanna go? Yeah.
Oh yeah, not just want to go, but before we delve into the three like female philosophers, I'd also want to ask a bit about your research method. So, would you mind telling us a bit of research, like how you found information about these women before we go into them?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I
Yeah.
guess when you're working in the history of philosophy, then your method is going to be quite different to potentially what other philosophers do. So yeah, so I'm kind of working on. I'm trying to write a book on these three figures that you mentioned. So the three figures are three women who were born towards the around the beginning of the 20th century. So Susan Stebbing, who is the first woman in Britain to be a professor of philosophy, and then Dorothy Emmett, who was the second woman in Britain to be a professor of philosophy, and Margaret MacDonald, who was another important figure in British philosophy during this period and was also a student of Susan Stebbing. So, in terms of what I mean, the first thing, I guess, often with any philosophers in history that I end up getting interested in, it's about kind of keeping your ear out for mention, whether it's in a book or at a conference or at a talk or just in conversation with somebody at the pub or whatever. They might throw away some reference to a name and say something interesting, and it's about sort of basically remembering that and having a Google and seeing they've got a Wikipedia page and going from there, right? And then I suppose finding the time to read their stuff. So the further back in history you go, often the easier it is to read philosophy quite quickly, because it's often, the older it is, the more likely it is to just be somewhere online to do with copyright and stuff. Reading some of their stuff, getting a sense of like what that philosopher's voice is, what their interests are, what their concerns are, what they think philosophy is about. And then I guess something that I am trying to do at the moment is archival research. So that's like reading diary entries or letters between those philosophers and other philosophers and their friends and family, and just like getting a sense of what they were like as a person, right? So one of the things that I'm really interested in when it comes to thinking about what we're doing when we do philosophy is thinking about the relationship between our philosophical ideas and our lives, right? And what's going on in the world around us. Because I think that a lot of people, when they think about philosophy, they think of somebody stroking their beard in an armchair in an ivory tower. It might be Descartes in his forest in the wood, cabin in the woods, or Kant, who never left his hometown of Königsberg, right? So people often think, right, a philosopher is somebody who separates themselves from the world and maybe even raises themselves above everyday life and ordinary concerns. But actually, and one of the things that you get when you read the figures that I'm interested in is a sense of like, actually, that's not really how it works, right? We might think that we're able to separate ourselves from real life and the mundane stuff that's going on around us, but actually, the experience we had when we grow up, the society we live in, the people that we engage with affect our views, right? And so that's something that, for example, all of these women that I was mentioning, they all lived through the Second World War. Well, they all lived through the First World War, right? But they were all adults, and by this point they were all doing philosophy by the time that the Second World War broke out. And that affected, for example, their views on ethics and morality, right? So one of the things that you get a really strong sense of in these women and other women from the 20th century is a really strong sense that like when there is such a thing as an objective wrong, right? People in the 1940s in Britain, for example, are getting video footage of what's going on in concentration camps or what's going on in Germany and stuff. And there's a really strong sense of like, there's something wrong with that, and that's a fact about the world. And for these kind of figures that I'm interested in, it troubled them that some of the views of other philosophers indicated that like rightness and wrongness weren't really facts about the world. They maybe boiled down to how we feel about things, and that's a different view. So, yeah, that was a really long answer to your question. But I guess thinking about what their philosophical views were is one part of my methodology. Trying to learn something about what they were really like is the other part.
Yeah,
I
that is
think
perfect.
that's really interesting. I once had a piece of advice for someone that I always follow, and that's that when you're starting to read an original text, whether it's Descartes, whether it's Thomas Hobbes, or whoever, you should always read the introduction because that's where the history is.
Yes.
I think people take that for granted, but you can really learn a lot about a person's views through the things that they've been through. Like I mentioned Hobbes. If you think, a lot of people say he had a very negative view of human nature, and then you look into the history of it, and he lived through a civil war during his writings, and a lot of the humanity he would have seen would have been quite nasty. Hence his sort of nasty, brutish, and short view of the world.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
just
I think in the 17th century, yeah, Hobbes is a good example, and there are others. Philosophers in Britain were really severely impacted in their views on human nature, on politics, on morality by the Civil War. Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
and then you sort of have Locke that comes in on that sort of that brighter note, as we're sort of coming out of that. So you can almost that's another thing I noticed with your research is this idea of history, and almost understanding it through the timeline. You can almost see that progression through the three scholars that you mentioned, from from the professor to the student, and then to another student, and that sort of progression there. So would you say that following these figures through time like that is quite common in this area of philosophy? Or
I think one thing that particularly scholars of kind of 20th century philosophy, and I guess lots of the history of philosophy is very interesting, but the further back you go, the more remote and sometimes more alien from us it can feel, right? Like, I mean, in fact, I mean, so if you read Aristotle or Plato, right, on the one hand, it's amazing because they say some things which sound totally relevant today, right? But some of the things they say, you're like, you need to be an ancient Greek scholar to know what they're on about, right? And I think one thing that people are interested in, and what sometimes gets people interested in 20th century history of philosophy, is like, it's not that far away, right? Like my grandparents overlapped with some of these people, right? Not literally. My grandparents probably didn't know anything about philosophy, right? They're farmers, but like timeline wise, and I think that what people are interested in often is tracing like basically like family trees, right? So people will say, Wittgenstein was taught by Russell. I actually don't know who Russell was taught by, but somebody out there in the world knows. And people are interested in that. I think that's important for understanding a philosopher's views and sort of where they're coming from. I think one thing that is interesting and worth thinking about when it comes to women in this context is they're much less likely to have this lineage for different reasons, right? So, I mean, in the case of Stebbing and MacDonald, it's a sort of very unfortunate reason, which is that they both died around the age of 50. So they both had illnesses that meant they died early. Other women from the time period, so another one of Stebbing's students, a philosopher called Elsie Wetnell, looked, in the 30s, you read stuff, you read archival stuff, you read reports of talks that were given in Cambridge and stuff, and it seems like she was a very up and coming philosopher. And then in 1939, she got married, and nobody ever heard from her again, right? So there's another thing so there's this kind of social issue of like, and actually, what you find with all three women that I've mentioned, none of them married in their lifetime, right? So there's a sense in which they maybe had to sort of trade off that element of their lives to remain in philosophy. It could also just be that like men in the history of philosophy are really bad at acknowledging and saying positive things about women. I mean,
Oh, Nietzsche. Not
right?
Nietzsche.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really bad stuff, right?
Yeah.
But even and on the level of like overt sexism. But there's also things like I think there's a sense in which when you read stuff from the 50s and the 60s, there's a sense in which they didn't really have to acknowledge that some woman might have influenced their work, right? It was like, well, look, I wrote this book and this is me and I'm interesting in his, and you should be interested in me less so. So there's all these different reasons to do with the social context and other things, but that mean that like it's much harder often to trace this lineage in when it comes to women in the history of philosophy compared to the big well-known household name men.
Yeah, agreed. And I think what is quite interesting to me is that Cambridge admitted like women a lot later than men too, only in the 20th century. So it's only been quite recent that women were able to study philosophy at a higher education and get a degree from it. And I think it's a good thing now that, especially that there's a lot more women in philosophy, albeit not as many as we would hope, like a 50-50 split. But yeah, it's quite interesting to hear that perspective from a social context.
Yeah. So, what was the first thing you just said? Then I thought it was interesting.
I said Cambridge only admitted women.
Yeah. So Cambridge was pretty late to do that. I mean,
Same with
there's a
Oxford, though.
figure. And the same with Oxford, yeah. I mean, this is just in my head because I've been in Cambridge the last couple of weeks. But there was a woman professor, not a philosopher, but an archaeologist. But she was called Dorothy Garrod, and she was the first woman to be a professor in any subject in Cambridge. But that was in 1938, which was still like almost 30 years before they started admitting women as students, which created this kind of administrative issue because they were like, can we even make a woman a professor if we don't have any students who are, we don't have any people getting degrees? In terms of women in philosophy, yeah, I mean, so there's an interesting, so there's like the Society for Women in Philosophy, SWIP, does this research every few years, and the statistics are pretty interesting. So for the last, there was a they did this I think they did it in 2021 and 2020. I can't remember, maybe it was different, but it's around recent years. And at undergraduate level, it's about 50-50, right, men and women. But as the more senior you get, so as you go through postgraduate studies, PhDs, and then actually jobs and then professorships, it suddenly becomes much more dominated by men as at each ring of. So there's something going on.
Yeah.
And obviously, like I talk about, I'm speaking from a position of privilege. I mean, well, from a position of patriarchal privilege in terms of I'm a man, right? And I'm a man in philosophy. But one of the things I think that we can do as historians of philosophy, and one of the things that kind of drives my own work, is if we can shed light on all the cool, amazing things that women were doing in the history of philosophy, then we can start to slowly, gradually change the idea that to be a philosopher, you got to be a guy with a beard, right? I mean, this is something that Kant literally said at some point, that there's this figure called Emily de Châtelet, who was a contemporary of Kant's, and he was so impressed by her that he said, she's such a good philosopher, she may as well have a beard, which sounds like a compliment, but it's basically just like, well, she can't, she almost basically she can't be a woman because she's good at philosophy, right? So she must be like a man.
Very backhanded compliment there.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's insane. I want to ask a follow-up question to that, and I think that's really interesting because to me that sounds like, is it a matter of giving women more opportunity to pursue professorship or like higher status in philosophy, or is it just adjusting to the time and letting time progress so we can allow more women into the field, or is it a combination of the two?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, I if I knew the answer, I'd like shout it more loudly, right? But I guess my hunch is, yeah, I can see the case for thinking, right, give it time and things will change, because that as time goes on, a lot of social issues do seem to get better, but also they obviously don't just get it better by themselves, right? They get better because people do things, right? Whether it's activism or So, for example, again, it's a sort of strange position that I'm in, or a slight contradiction, because I have no issue, for example, or I would probably say is a good idea for philosophy departments to be like, and philosophy departments do this. They often put job ads out and say we're particularly interested in applications from women or people from diverse minority groups. So yeah, one option would be for departments to employ basically affirmative action policies and basically say, like, we specifically want to hire women. Obviously, like, that could mean that in the future I don't get a job, but I guess that's like, that's a small price to pay. But yeah, I think it's really difficult. But I think, right, one thing I think that we can definitely do as lecturers and teachers in philosophy is just teach more women, right? Is just still the number of times you pick up a course syllabus and you see the usual suspects, a list full of men with maybe 10% women covered in a semester long course. That shouldn't be happening, right? I think people, I think that one way of not, not even saying, but just showing to young women in philosophy that philosophy is for them, is to show, like, look at all these women who've done philosophy, right? Look at these, as opposed to like doing a bunch of courses and encountering the usual suspects, and then having somebody who's interested in this kind of stuff do a course on women in philosophy. Because what that indicates is, like, oh yeah, and women can do it too, but it's like a niche thing that, like, it's women do these particular topics, or for example, like, women only study feminism, but that's not true. Like, women have studied lots of different areas and have lots of different views. And so I think that's one thing, and that doesn't go just for women, right? That goes for, like, diverse voices of all sorts, right? Whether it's non-European philosophies and so on. Just sort of diversifying what we're showing our students philosophy looks like.
I mean, I feel like we need to start doing that even earlier. I think if you look at the A-level courses that me and Cass are doing, I mean, we have a running joke in my school that our classroom is just filled with old straight white guys, because when you look at the displays around the room, they all look the same. There's the classic philosopher guy with a beard. I think in our whole sort of curriculum, women are mentioned twice. The main one being Philippa Foot comes up in the ethics section. And I think a lot of that has to do with when we're teaching the basics of philosophy, we start at the start. We always start our course when they start in year 12. They start with ancient Greek philosophy, and they move forward. So I wonder if it's a sort of the answer is almost more towards introducing young people to contemporary philosophy. Because I mean, even I myself, when I tell people that I'm going to study philosophy, it's like people still do that. It doesn't feel like, when you say philosophy, people think of some old guy. Yeah, it's a stereotype that's there. So I feel like we need to be introducing more niche areas of philosophy. We need to be talking about 20th century scholars. We should be talking about feminist philosophy. We're gonna do an episode soon on queer theology and sort of LGBTQ plus theology, and the sort of the links into religion. So it's just having more space for people to discuss this, especially with our generation, I think would be really important. So
I mean, I think you're totally right. Yeah, and you're right. Like, encountering it when you're 19, 20 years old at university, because presumably if you've chosen to study philosophy, it's because you already know something about philosophy. And so if the rot has set in terms of the connection between being a philosopher and having a beard has already taken root, then it might be too late, or at least people like me, lecturers, are going to have to do a job of unraveling that connection and then showing, like, I mean, and I do think that there are, like, Philippa Foot is a great example, but yeah, maybe just not. So one of the things I'm really interested in is the idea that the history of philosophy is a bunch of stories, right? I mean, it sounds like a sort of obvious thing to say, and the clue's in the name, his story, right? But stories are things we tell for particular reasons, right? And there is a usual story of the history of philosophy that starts with Aristotle and Plato, and then goes to like Thomas Aquinas, and then it goes to Descartes and Locke and Kant, and then it goes to Hegel and Nietzsche, and then it's Russell and Wittgenstein, and you're like, oh, all of those people had something in common, right? So why is that the story that's been told for, at least the last 100 years, if not more? And it's, and it's, there's like an agenda there, right? So one is to just tell different versions of the story, right? Look for a contemporary of Plato and Aristotle who's a woman, right? Someone like Hypatia, right? Or Sappho. There are ancient thinkers who, they weren't all men with beards, right? And the same is true of any time period. Or as you said, yeah, I think or just go with topics or something like that. Just shake things up, right? Because this thing that scholars call the canon. The canon is like meant to be. I mean, the canon is like that list of men I just it's meant to be the most important figures and texts and ideas in the history of philosophy. But it's like, who the canon is not something that you just find like plants and trees in nature. Somebody's invented it, and they obviously had like their own views and values, and maybe it's and so we have different views and values, so let's like do something to that canon, right? But yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's got to be like, as soon as people are introduced to philosophy, they're introduced to diverse forms of philosophy. It's not enough to say there's philosophy and it's the stuff that Aristotle and Plato did, and then 2-3 years later, but there are also different types of philosophy, right? Because I think it's too late then, and it also suggests there's like proper philosophy and then this other kind of philosophy.
Yeah, I think that comes with a distinction of continental and analytic philosophy, though, because obviously what I'm studying is just analytic. It's just, there's nothing about continental. And that's kind of hard because they're kind of a running joke in my classroom, too. We have the philosophy room, and we have portraits of Locke and Descartes scribbled in funny illustrations. But one time we were trying to make like a collage of female philosophers, but nobody knew any other than de Beauvoir or Somerville or like Patricia Churchland. Like,
Right.
where else can we make it accessible to find female philosophers as well? So I think there kind of needs to be like a platform that could enhance these voices other than like articles or academic works as well. And you see that more often with books. I think there is this one book that details like 50 female philosophers. But yeah, I haven't seen that
There's a
around in a
book
while.
called The Philosopher Queens, right?
There we
Which
go.
is,
I think that's the one.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that is aimed at like anybody, and that's not to say that it's not a good book. I mean, it is. It's everything in there is great, but it goes it goes all the way back, and it says like, look at here's it just answers that question that you said that people are asking, like, who are the women philosophers? But there needs to be more of that. It needs to keep happening, right? It needs to those stories need to keep getting told, because the reason that the usual story, the story about all the men, feels so important is because it's a story that people have told over and over and over and over again. So we just need to keep telling the other story over and over and over again, so that becomes important too, or like seems as important as it is.
Okay, but I think that was a fantastic answer. So speaking of telling their stories, should we speak a bit about Susan Stebbing to get started?
Yes, let's. Yeah, I mean, so Susan Stebbing, so first woman in Britain to be a philosophy professor, 1933. So she was a professor at a place called Bedford College, which is a university that doesn't exist anymore. But Bedford College was a really important place for women in philosophy in Britain in the early to mid 20th century. So it was really kind of like a pipeline through which women were coming out into the profession. And as I said earlier, Stebbing died quite early in her life, but you really can't help but wonder, if she had lived to 90, how many more women she would have helped come through that pipeline. So she is, if people know her, it's probably because of work she did on logic, metaphysics, philosophy of language. So initially she kind of made her name in philosophy through doing this kind of hardcore analytic technical stuff. But basically, as she got older and as time marched on towards the beginning of the Second World War, she really began to feel that philosophy should have a role to play in ordinary life. And Stebbing wrote in this book, and we were talking about teaching women philosophers to A-level students. I think this, I always say there's a book she wrote called Thinking to Some Purpose, which is really just about like what does it mean to think philosophically? What are the kind of things that philosophers do? They put together logical arguments. They spot fallacies. They tell the difference between somebody presenting you with a fact and somebody presenting you with an opinion. So it's really like what we would call kind of critical thinking now, right? And I think that's a book that I think people should be, I think, for example, it's a book that people could be reading as soon as they begin studying philosophy. So that book came out in 1939. She wrote another book during the war called Ideals and Illusions, which is a book about how the role of moral philosophy is to work out how we should live our lives. And she thinks philosophers need to step in and do something because there are some really bad ideas. She's looking over to what's happening in Nazi Germany. And she's like, there's some really bad ideas out there about how people should live their lives and what it's okay to do and what it's not okay to do. And the role of a philosopher, a moral philosopher, should be to explain why that's not a good way to live a life and why other ways of living your life are better. So I guess that's a kind of potted history of Susan Stebbing. Yeah.
I'm wondering if we can sort of go a bit more into maybe one of her main metaphysical ideas, if there's anything jumping out to you that you think would be interesting.
Yeah, okay. So what should I talk about?
I mean, I kind of I know. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Go on,
Sorry.
Cass. Yeah.
No, I kind of had an idea of like, because when we're talking about thinking clearly, and obviously with the context of World War II, it kind of made me think about how can we think clearly about this war and how can we avoid, what kind of information is fed into us and how can we kind of rearrange it in our brains. So what I mean by this is talking about propaganda and looking into the political philosophy aspect of Susan Stebbing's thoughts. But if you have any other metaphysical ideas, I'm more than happy to discuss that as well.
No, I mean, so that's really what Thinking to Some Purpose is about. So throughout the text, she has like excerpts from politicians' speeches. So as from a 21st century perspective, it can feel a bit dated. But you can imagine, I think what's cool is you could imagine doing the same thing with political speeches today, right? Taking the speeches, and she basically just says to the reader, like, right, what's wrong with this, basically? And she says, like, look, or sometimes either it's political speeches or excerpts from newspapers and so on, and she kind of shows you, look, you might think that what the newspaper is doing is presenting you with a series of facts, but it's trying to get you to feel a certain way. So, for example, she's talking about the Spanish Civil War, right? Which the Times of London newspaper was anti the Spanish Civil War, right? And she takes this excerpt from the Times and she says, look at the words they're using to describe the Spanish. And they're all like sort of negative connotation words. And then look at the words they're using to describe like the opposition forces. Or maybe it's the other way around. You can tell I'm not an actual historian, right? But like the point is, she's like, you pick up a newspaper and you think, right, I'm just going to learn some facts. I'm just going to learn what is going on. But you're really being made to feel a certain way. And she says, like, it's really important to be aware of that. Every time you pick up a newspaper, every time you listen to a politician speak on the radio, or every time you like hear an advert on the radio, because advertising corporations are trying to do the same thing too, right? They might present you with a bunch of facts or facts in inverted commas about what a healthy lifestyle looks like, and it just so turns out that their product is one of the things that contributes to a healthy lifestyle. And again, the point is they're trying to get you to do something. And so she thinks
Yeah.
we all have this natural ability to think clearly. Like that's like part of what it is to be human.
Yeah.
But the world is full of barriers to thinking clearly, it's full of obstacles.
Yeah, I see her point, and I do agree, but I feel like it's a lot harder now in modern society, especially with social media. I think that's what
Mm.
she kind of means by a barrier. And what I mean by that is that it's getting harder to think critically because there's so much information going on. Like you have Reels, you have TikTok, you have YouTube Shorts. You scroll for like 15 seconds and you get
Mm.
fed with more and more information, and it's basically like a cycle. It's a loop. And so sometimes I find myself switching to autopilot mode. Yes, I'm a victim to this. And it's interesting to me because this kind of parallels with Brexit as well, especially because like during Brexit, like during the whole campaign, you had like 1.3 million tweets everywhere, and it's kind of reinforced this echo chamber. And I think that stops us from A, being cognitively flexible, but B, also just like seeing things from a different viewpoint. And I don't know, how can we challenge these ideals if we do not have the tools to critically think? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does, and I think I often when I'm reading when I read Thinking to Some Purpose, I just think like if she thought it was problematic then, like trying to think clearly, wow. Now, yeah, I mean, I think like this doesn't sound like a super deep philosophical point, but I guess it's also important. The kind of general message you get from reading Stebbing is, basically take everything with a pinch of salt, or in other words, think. Like that's the instruction. Just don't just read stuff. Don't just absorb whatever you see on TikTok or what you see on Twitter or what you see in the newspaper or what you hear on the radio. Think about what's going on, right? Think about why is the person saying this? Like what do they want to get out of, on Twitter, and I'm going to call it Twitter, right? I'm not calling it X. But like on Twitter, or during Brexit or whatever, or various politicians, they'll say something outlandish, and you initially think, right, they actually think that this is true, and they think it's important to tell you this, whether it's like a claim about migration or whatever. But then you kind of often think a bit, think a little bit longer, and you think, well, actually, all they want to do is just get your attention, right? Like, so what's the right way to respond? Like, don't give them any attention, as opposed to like getting on your keyboard and responding really angrily, because that's like exactly what they want, right? So I think the kind of general message that Stebbing would give is like, just I think she would put it this way, right? Engage with media actively rather than passively. Don't go, whether it's a newspaper, it'd be great if we could trust all our news sources to be just passive receivers, but we got to go in there actively engaging with what we're looking at, with what we're reading. And then the book itself has got specific ways of doing that, right? So she talks about like when a slogan is useful and when it's not useful. So like she says, like a good slogan is a slogan that actually is actually contains some information, whereas a bad slogan is like, she says, it's like it's like, she says it's like potted meat, right? This is a dated reference to like rations during the war. So she says like, potted meat used to have some nutrients, but now it's just like an empty blob. And she says like, bad slogans are like that. And the one I always think of is during the Brexit referendum, Brexit means Brexit, right? Which
Yeah.
sounds informative, but then you're like, okay, but what does Brexit mean? It doesn't really contain any information, right? So there's an example of a bad slogan. So the book has got all these specific examples of ways of thinking that'll help us to think more clearly.
Just on the Brexit thing, there was the bring back slogans as well, where
Oh,
by the end of it, he was just shouting random words, wasn't he, Boris Johnson?
Yeah, like
There was
the bendy bananas and the prawn cocktail crisps and stuff.
what?
yeah, it's just I think sort of off this, we could maybe try and apply the the ideas of Stebbing to this idea of meaningless media that we seem to see in our generation. It's something that
Yeah.
me and Cass would refer to as brain rot,
Oh,
which is
yeah.
the meme at the moment. And it's this idea that social media, with the rise of sort of artificial intelligence and these sorts of technologies, is just filled with utter nonsense. Like some of
Yeah.
it doesn't even pertain to any sort of meaning. It is just there for clicks. It's there for
Yeah.
this sort of absurdism.
Mm.
So people suddenly go, "Oh yeah, that's sort of funny because it makes no sense." And then I'm just wondering, with this idea that Stebbing brings forth about how we consume media, how she'd apply this to the sort of media we have now, when the whole by design it doesn't have any meaning.
Yeah, I mean, like I'm a bit older than well, I'm older, not just a bit. I'm older than you guys, right? So I'm not on TikTok, but you know, in
Good.
various places on social media, I'm very familiar with that. You're like, what is this? Like,
Mm.
and I'm not opposed to a meme, and I think that some things on social media can really capture things that are funny or meaningful, or like half the way that me and my siblings respond to each other is just like with memes or little videos we've seen. And I guess the same idea that I was just talking about is applied. Like, okay, maybe it's not about the form of the thing, right? Little videos or whatever can be meaningful if they contain something, right? If they've got some nutrients to them. Whereas it's the kind of AI generated ones, or probably AI generated ones that have never come from a real human thought. That they're just like tagging on to things that are in, presumably they just detect like this type of meme or video
It's to
or
do with
picture.
the data. So
Right.
a lot of these sort of these new AI technologies are built on sort of lots and lots of data, just like all of these algorithms are just, they've compiled everything that they can gain, and they're just like regurgitating it in to make it look original, but really they've just compiled thousands and thousands
Mhm.
of resources, and a lot of it tends to be really problematic. There was a TED talk I watched once. I wish I could remember the name of the guy that did it, but I will link it in the description on YouTube if anyone's interested. But he talked about these algorithms and how, because all the data from the internet, nobody ever sort of proves this data. It's like thousands and thousands and thousands, going back to when the internet was created, and it's a lot of it is really problematic. And he spoke about how we were ended up with these YouTube Kids videos that were like
Mm.
spewing Nazi propaganda, because they're just taking
Mhm.
all of this problematic data and they're outputting it. So this is another thing that I don't think Stebbing could even have predicted, this idea of this regurgitation of all of these thoughts, and it's making the process of understanding even more convoluted.
Yeah. I have another point to add to that, but it's kind of on the flip side. It's kind of far-fetched, but hear me out, okay? Please hear me out. I think it doesn't always have to be problematic though. It could be for a
Hmm.
good reason. For example, I feel like the basis of brain rot and the basis of memes is to share connections, is to be able to relate to someone,
Hmm.
even if it's from a form of memory. So what I mean by that is right now we're having a Brat Summer Kamala Harris campaign going on. I don't even know if you know what that means. But
I'm aware of that. Yeah.
I
yeah,
don't
but
think I am, so
okay, I'll
you might
explain it
need
to you.
to.
So basically, there's this neon green color from an album by Charlie XCX, and they
Yeah, I've
basically
seen that.
assigned that value to Kamala Harris for her campaign. I'm not sure why, calling her Brat Summer. And basically, I think this is really important to note that the time period where we're seeing this, as well as as well as the people who are consuming it, are having this shared moment where they can share their opinion or relate to something through brain rot. And through that, I think it's kind of helpful. It kind of keeps us stable in a kind of sense. Because I don't think
Mm.
humans are very social creatures. That's my own personal opinion. And that's why I think like memes are very good, and having language that communicates that, having to share the same ideas and put the same image in each other's head is quite crucial to a campaign or slogan or sharing ideas, basically. I don't know if that was an
Yeah,
interesting ramble, but
that's
I tried.
that's really interesting. I think from that, from what I'm seeing on the socials, we can say that Brat Summer kind of seems to mean whatever anyone wants it to mean. And I think it's just
Yeah,
become another sort of
exactly.
like vehicle of communication. So I think that's less problematic than the sort of the things we've mentioned previously. I think
With the Nazi propaganda, that's a bit
being able to
off.
use these sorts of formulas to advance our sort of understanding and platforms is okay, but when we're sort of diluting the media streams with a lot of
Oh,
bad
sure.
media that we should have gotten rid of, that's where the problem arises.
Yeah, and I feel like it isn't a big issue, in my opinion, that we are condensing these medias into short video forms, or just condensing so much information into short forms that we miss out all the crucial details. Because there is no way that we can like compile Nazi propaganda in 1 minute. That's just
Mm.
absurd. So there needs to be like 30-minute videos, but the problem is that our attention span has gotten so bad that we can't sustain watching things anymore, if that makes sense.
I think that's it, right? I think you both said some really interesting stuff there. I mean, I guess if Stebbing's writing in the 30s, just could not have envisioned
Yeah, exactly.
what the hell we're talking about now. But like, but I think there's something about attention spans, and I think that I guess like the Brat Summer Kamala Harris thing. Now, obviously, the word positive depends on your own views, right? But it seems to me personally like it's having a positive effect if it gets young people engaged in America and voting for Harris. That's great. I mean, equally that could be worrying, right? Like if the only reason they're voting is because they like the brat girl aesthetic, or that's it's going to be a fairly thin, hollow victory, right? That's could easily be manipulated in the other way by an opponent who thinks like, well, okay, I know what I got to do then, right? I got to basically be cool.
Yeah.
The thing about attention span, I mean, I was thinking about this prior to the UK election because there's this social media organization led by donkeys. I don't know if you guys are familiar. They're like an activist group, and they put very anti-conservative, and so they
Right.
were putting out these 10-minute videos on Twitter, and like I'm a millennial, but even that's like it was a struggle for me to sit down and watch. But I sort of forced myself because I thought like, right, this is they'd be these 10-minute kind of deep dives on the background of Nigel Farage or Rishi Sunak or
Yeah.
whoever. But even for me, it's like I was kind of like, why couldn't this just be like a 30-second video just so I can watch it
Yeah.
in between scrolls? But I think that's the thing that Stebbing would take issue with is like less to do with what's going on in terms of AI algorithms and stuff, but more in terms of how we respond to it. I think she would
Yeah.
think like, and one of the things she says is that if you want to live in a democracy, you need to put the work in, right? You can't coast. You need to be proactive. You need to think deeply, and thinking deeply is hard. But if you want to keep living in a democracy, you got to do it, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's true. That applies generally in these cases, right? Because this is a very general claim, but I think that problems arise because we're all, we all go for convenience, and we're all, I'm as guilty as we're scrolling. We're all just scrolling, and like sitting
For
down and watching
comfort.
a 10-minute video and informing yourself is difficult, but or just fact checking, right? Like you see a tweet that says X has happened. Let's look up another source and see whether that verifies it, or if it's just that tweet, right? And I guess that's what thinking deeply and thinking critically involves, and thinking clearly
Mm.
comes out of that.
Yeah,
I think.
putting more work and being more attentive to it is what Stebbing would say, right?
I think so. Yeah, just
Would
engaging with public discourse in a proactive way, where you
would you
and
say we're losing that ability though? This idea of
Mm.
thinking clear that she puts across, is that is that something that our generation, are starting to lose? Is we're sort of swerving more towards this short form content, or is that is that still in there somewhere?
I think. I mean, look, like I'm obviously just speaking on my own experience, but I guess maybe, but also maybe thinking clearly is not something that it's thinking really totally. I think that this is this old idea in philosophy that if you use this thing called reason, then you can cut through propaganda, emotion, feeling, and see truth, right? There's lots of philosophers in the history of philosophy who think that like just use this faculty of reason. And sometimes it sounds like that's kind of what Stebbing's getting at. But at other times she says, I mean, one of my favorite Stebbing quotes, which I always quote to my students, is she says, like, it is, we need to remember, not, sorry, I got the quote wrong. It is, we need to remember human beings that think, not purely rational beings, right? Like, so and I guess all that means is like, when you have a thought, check in with yourself and think, why do I think that? Is it because of my upbringing? Is it because of a prejudice I might have? Is it because of some emotional association with whatever it is that I'm responding to? And then, like, should I think that? Does the evidence support thinking that, right? And that, that might be like people responding to immigration, to the small boats crisis, to nationalism, whatever. Like, yeah, if I'm being honest with myself, should I really think that? Like, is there actually evidence for that? And I guess what I would be tempted to say is that type of process doesn't go on enough in people's everyday.
I wonder if we'd all be better off if we all went and lived in a cabin in the woods like Descartes.
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe
Yeah,
he
but
was onto something.
imagine what the internet would be like. We'd all be on the internet instead. So
That is
yeah,
true.
it'd be a
Unless
lot
we
worse.
just like throw our phone out the window and just like start grinding.
I'm not sure I'd be capable of doing that. I'm too reliant on it. I think
Yeah, exactly.
we've got
That's the problem.
we've got to remember we wouldn't be sitting doing this right now without this sort of virtual software that we've got. So there are
Exactly.
some positives.
Mm-hmm.
true.
Yeah.
I think we sort of got really into Susan Stebbing there, but we're reaching the 1 hour mark. So I'm wondering if we should sort of start to wrap up. If there's any sort of final comments or final questions from you, Cass?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more than happy to look at the other two next time because I think they're very interesting too. But
yeah, we could always make a part 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like that's what talking about these figures is what I'm into. So yeah, I mean, I could just say something briefly about both of them, if just to sort of, if that might be helpful, just to connect Stebbing to.
Yeah.
Like,
if you give us a bit of a background on your others.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it makes sense that we've talked a lot about Stebbing. She's a philosopher who I've spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about and reading stuff. So, and I think she's a really, really important figure. I guess the reason that I'm kind of looking at more than one figure, though, is that I'm kind of interested in this historical period as it was for a generation of women in philosophy, right? So Stebbing, along with Dorothy Emmett and Margaret MacDonald, are meant to be kind of representative sample of that. So yeah, MacDonald was a student of Stebbing's, and then the two of them founded this journal, which was called Analysis, which was like the journal of analytic philosophy, right? So they are really important to the history of analytic philosophy, this way of doing philosophy that most of us in the English-speaking world do. Dorothy Emmett is another figure who, like Stebbing, her philosophical views were very heavily influenced by her experience of the war. So she was writing philosophy books in between air raid sirens when she lived in Manchester in the 1940s. So, I mean, that's a kind of amazing thing to think about. Like, what could be more different than being Descartes in the cabin in the woods than having to scribble down notes in between like a bomb going off nearby you? So, yeah, I mean, there's loads more that could be said, but I guess I would just like encourage people to look those thinkers up, all right? Because they, as we've said, as we've begun with, like, take any period in the history of philosophy and there were women doing cool things. And also what's interesting is like you get a much more like diverse sense of what philosophers think about and the way they think about it if you look at a more diverse set of voices, right? Because the thing that can happen is you can think like, God, not a lot has changed in philosophy if like, you know, people in the 1920s basically agreed with what Aristotle said. But actually there's a load of disagreement and loads of different perspectives the more diverse you read.
I think that's a really great note to end on. Given our discussions all about media, is to be a bit more mindful about what we're consuming. As funny as some of these memes and reels and TikToks and whatever are. Think about what you're watching, and really take a moment to reflect. Is this diverse? Does this make any sense? Why do I think the things that I do? So
and try to
thank
challenge
you.
your own thoughts too.
Yeah, no, that's really important.
That's a real stebbing. She says it's really important that we challenge our most cherished beliefs. So you almost quoted Stebbing there.
Well, nearly.
You were just channeling her and through this episode, you know. She's with you.
I'm like mini Stebbing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time on today's episode, Peter. It's really, really appreciated. For our audience members, we really hope you enjoyed this conversation. You know, we're going to be putting this on Spotify, on YouTube, as we normally do. So feel free to sort of get in the comments, get more engaged, and we'll be we can respond to any further questions. We can pass questions on, these sorts of things. But it was a really great conversation. And a really important conversation. So until next time, we'll see you all later.